Welcome to Family Development Theory and Life Course Perspective. These combined theories are really about patterns of change experienced by families as they move through stages and events associated with the family life course. So this theory has had basically 4 different iterations or phases. We're really just going to be focusing on the first one, the family life cycle by Duval, and the most current one, life course perspective. So here's the basic assumptions or kind of the givens of family development and life course perspectives. And actually these apply to all 4 of those iterations. Any iteration of family development or life course would follow these assumptions. And these are first that families develop over time. And this is called diachronic time, but this just means that in order to understand families or individuals within families, we need to view them over time. So for example, I have a colleague who studies low-income, non-custodial fathers and their involvement with their own kids over time. And he explores with them how their dads actually interacted with them, how that influences their current interactions with their kids, and then maybe how their interactions with their kids evolve from, say, their 20s to their 30s. Another assumption is just like individuals, families also undergo stages of development, and they have tasks at each of these stages. And we're going to get into some more examples of that with Duval's model. So you've learned about stage models for individuals like Piaget or Erikson. This is essentially kind of a stage model in some ways for families. And so we might take the example of the stage of a couple relationship forming. And then they have these developmental tasks of figuring out how they're dividing paid and unpaid labor, what they're doing about sexual intimacy, how they're resolving conflict or managing communication. And then the next assumption is how a family does at one stage predicts how well they will cope with the next one. So basically, we've talked about this a little bit before, but if we know where a family's been, we can often predict kind of where they're headed. We can see what their trajectories have been, whether that's one of kind of more health or one of more challenge and adversity. Then the next assumption is that families must be viewed in multiple contexts. And we're going to get into these more, but this is things like how does our income, our race and ethnicity, our sexual orientation, our gender identity, our time in history, our geography, our work, how do these all influence a family's experience, especially experiences of events like births or deaths or, new life stages like the transition to parenthood or retirement. So for example, thinking about Iris, she currently is starting college. She has a lot of privilege. And yet if she came out as gay or trans or she developed a disability, her experience of privilege would change. Her social context would change in this time of transition. The last concept that we will keep coming back to, or assumption, is that individual development influences other family members and overall family development. So your developmental tasks influence your family members, their developmental tasks influence you. This is really kind of like the idea of interdependence from family systems, and I'll give you some more examples of it. So continuing with this idea that individual and family development are reciprocal and influence each other, I think we talk a lot in HDFS about children's development, and of course we're talking about adult development, but it doesn't get quite as much of attention. And so we have to remember that parents have their own developmental paths and stages and tasks going on. They're not just witnessing a child's development. They are developing at the very same time. And so the way I think about this, it's not just us as audience members clapping for our kids through their own development. We're doing that, and then we're kind of rushing off to do our own developmental tasks. And so an example of this from my childhood is that when I was in 8th grade, my mom's mom died kind of young. And this launched my mom into a midlife crisis in which she stopped being a stay-at-home mom and went back to work and then to school, which led my dad, who had been very focused on his work, to have to focus less on work and more on kind of grocery shopping and household labor. It also meant that I had to babysit my brother, which he hated because I was terrible, and it probably was a challenge to his development. But it also meant no one was around to keep me from watching soap operas, which were forbidden. But as a 13-year-old, probably gave me a freedom that I really needed developmentally. So this example of how my mom's developmental tasks kind of had these reverberations throughout the family and influenced all of our development. So remember, Duvall's family life cycle was the first phase of these sets of theories. It was developed in the 1940s and 50s, and it's really based on that idea of a traditional family, or that SNAF, standard North American family, the heterosexual couple with 2 biological children. And so as you view the 8 stages on the next slide, be thinking kind of, what are the limitations of this model? Okay, so this is that very early version of the theory, Duvall's family life cycle from the 1940s or 50s, these 8 stages, and it does a nice job just giving us a sense of what tasks associated with family stages are, and it gives us a sense of what family stages might look like. But if you think about your own family and whether or not you manage to fit in these or not, what we begin to realize is that this doesn't do a great job of encompassing the diversity of families that we have right now. What about people who don't ever have kids, or who don't partner but still have families, or people who have a baby before they get married, or people who divorce and then have a blended family, or what about cohabitation, which is probably a new stage for many couples that isn't reflected in this model. So there's quite a few limitations to this early version of the theory. Okay, so just to reiterate, Duvall's family life cycle, while useful in helping us kind of think about family stages and tasks, isn't currently being used by researchers today. Okay, so let's talk through some specific concepts and propositions related to these family development, family life cycle, life course perspective theories. And these concepts and propositions apply to all 4 versions of the theory. And so we've talked about some of this already, right? That stages are essentially periods of stability in the family where we've kind of, maybe more accomplished our tasks, figured out our roles, our divisions of labor, and we have more stability. And then we go through periods of transitions between our stages where we're changing our roles and our rules and our routines. And once we go through that, there's kind of this shift, so my husband and I just went through this becoming empty nesters, our kind of who's doing what, what we had to do changed, who's doing it changed a little bit, our patterns and habits have changed. And there's this period of time when we are in transition where we feel a little bit disorganized, right? Who's in the family might be different, like my kids aren't here now. I definitely noticed myself turning to my husband a lot more and really truthfully valuing him more because he's the only person I have, at home. So that would be kind of some ways that we've shifted our interactions. And we can also just struggle a little bit at the beginning of a new stage. So I think back to when I was launching my oldest into kind of young adulthood, I just felt so disorganized to figure out once he turned 18 how I was supposed to treat him differently. And I didn't get it figured out right away. I was kind of still policing him too much in screens and exercise. It took me a while to relax and kind of get my new kind of roles and his roles kind of established. These theories also talk about the timing of our life events and transitions. And these life events and transitions that we experience can be considered on time or off time, or normative or non-normative. And I'll give you a sense of kind of what that means. So on time, it means this is the time we would expect you to do this. Off time means this is at an unexpected time. So Off time could be giving birth when you're, early 40s, and when you already have some children in college, for example. Or off time might be having a parent die when you're a teenager, or these days getting married at 18. Sometimes events are both off time and non-normative, like an unplanned teen pregnancy. But then some things are non-normative, but not about timing. So having a child with a developmental disability, maybe, when you at 30, that's not off time, but it's considered non-normative because it's unexpected. And these whether something is on time or off time, normative or non-normative, is always determined by our social norms. So obviously there were periods of time where getting married at 20 was considered on time, and now it's considered off time. Cohabitation used to be considered non-normative, but now it's considered more normative. It used to be maybe non-normative to return home after college. Now that's considered a little bit not more normative in the United States. All right, so now let's talk about life course specifically. So it uses everything we've talked about so far: family stages, tasks, roles, time, transitions, and it adds a few new concepts. So the first one is multiple time clocks and some various conceptualizations of time. So of those, the first one is ontogenetic or individual time. This is basically your chronological age at any given time. How old are you? Are you 9? Are you 21? Are you 65? So these pictures here are of two women who are the same ontogenetic age because they're both seniors in high school, both about 18 years old. Cohort, though, is based on the year you were born, and also kind of what generation do you belong to. So if you take a look at these pictures again, these two women are of two different cohorts. One graduating, say, in the 1960s and one in the 1990s. So same ontogenetic time, but different cohort or generational time. And then historical time refers to events that occur basically with the passage of time and how they influence individuals and families. And historical events can produce cohort effects. So if we think back to these two women who are high school seniors, and then we think about the women's movement that came, after, or kind of in between their the times that they were both 18, the high school senior in the 60s, may have decided, for example, to become a teacher because that was just one of 4 jobs available to her, the others being like secretary, nurse, and domestic. But the one in the 90s, who was reaping the benefits of the women's movement, kind of, she might have decided to become a teacher because she actually likes kids. In fact, there were lots of career options, and so she picked teacher because of the joy of kids. So that historical event, the women's movement, really changed the experience of choosing a career for women who came after that time period, essentially. Okay, so test yourself on this. These women have the same ontogenetic age, but not the same cohort. So we talked about a basic assumption of all of these versions of this theory, that families must be viewed in a social context. And life course perspective takes that even a little bit further to think about the social institutions that are occurring at our time in history and our place in the world, which leads us to have what's called heterogeneity in our life trajectories, very different experiences. So even, if we think of just one time period, being gay in an urban town versus a rural town is a different social context, a different type of place, leads to a different life trajectory. Agency is basically our ability and our desire to make choices, yet how we create our lives through choices within the constraints of our social context, of our time and place, of our social institutions. So for example, I have different life choices than someone who is living in a developing country or a woman living 100 years ago. And then meaning is the meaning that we give to the changes throughout our life course, and it's really based a lot on our social context. So we think about the meaning of what it means to be a father now versus in the 1970s and 80s, when it was still perhaps a lot more around providing or the disciplinarian. We think about the meaning that parents of transgender kids might be making in the 1980s, different time, or in a different place, or different social context, if they are African American living in New York City versus, white families living in Kansas. So how meaning kind of occurs within this social context. So a couple more concepts: trajectories and turning points. So trajectories are basically a person's life path. And our life paths have times that are more stable, and then there can be shifts before we move to a new kind of stable path. So for me, I had key shifts around forming a long-term relationship, that it was a big change and then became a stable pattern, and then transitioning to parenthood, that was another big shift, and transitioning to career, another big shift. And then things were pretty stable for a lot of years until I transitioned to empty nest. Our social context, like we've talked about, means that we basically have a cumulative advantage or disadvantage. We have privilege or lack thereof, resources that we kind of carry with us. And so this figure here shows two different trajectories. Person A has a lot more resources or cumulative advantage and can bounce back from adversity, where person B can't. Turning points are life events that change our trajectories. And this figure is highlighting adverse or negative life events, but we can imagine that these life events can be positive, negative, or neutral, like just changing careers or geographical locations. The life course perspective suggests that there's three types of life events that can become turning points. Those that open or close opportunities. So for example, I can think of when I got my very first part-time teaching job, but how that led to more full-time options, created more opportunities for me. Life events that make a lasting change in an individual's environment. Meeting my husband was a lasting change to my environment in many ways, but one of the small ones was I followed him to Colorado. So that was a profound kind of change in my trajectory. Or life events that change a person's self-concept, identity, beliefs, or expectations. For me, this also came in the form of a person meeting my best friend Amanda during my senior year of high school. Really led me to rethink some of the beliefs that I'd grown up with politically and religiously, and really changed kind of my identity. So here's an empirical example of researchers using life course perspective, and more specifically the concept of turning points. And this was a longitudinal study exploring the idea of the school to prison pipeline. And they were using a national longitudinal data sample from 1997 to 2011, following adolescents through their 20s and early 30s. And they were investigating whether or not school suspensions became a turning point in adolescents' lives, thus leading them to a higher risk of incarceration. And they did find that to be the case, that school suspensions became this kind of turning point that led to almost a 3 times increased likelihood of later incarceration. And this was even controlling for their level of delinquency or offending, their socioeconomic status, their family routines or lack thereof, their perceptions of school. So you could say, oh, it's not really about the suspension, it's about everything else that was going on. But actually, when they even controlling for all that, suspensions increased the likelihood of incarceration 3 times. So basically a negative turning point in people's lives. And so then this has implications. We'll be talking about family policy at the end of this class, but it has implications for replacing this kind of idea of zero tolerance policies, which emerged after Columbine in trying to create more safety, and we really kind of cracked down with maybe things like a restorative justice model where people are given chances to make amends and they don't have this big change maybe in their identity. Researchers also just pointed out, in addition to higher rates of incarceration, suspension is associated with lower levels of school attendance following suspension, lower self-esteem after suspension, poorer academic performance, less likely to graduate, more likely to drop out, higher levels of anxiety, more likelihood of getting arrested. And that, again, seems to be above and beyond just someone's life circumstances. So a nice, a difficult topic, especially because suspensions are significantly higher for Black students or those with disabilities, but an important kind of application of this idea of a turning point and what we should be doing about it. So linked lives just builds on that development is reciprocal assumption that we talked about at the beginning of this lecture. It's this idea that we have a shared history, and we have linked lives, in the form of networks of relationships, both within our families, and this is very similar to the idea of interdependence in family systems theory, but we also have linked lives in the wider world, how we're influenced by teachers or other professionals, or our friends or our friends' parents. And even by taking this class together, our lives are linked and it's affecting our developmental trajectories. So this is an empirical example of a research study explicitly using life course perspective and the idea of linked lives. And they basically studied adults and their adult children and how parents of adult children were influenced by the life events or the transitions that their adult children were going through. And so if, for example, adult children were getting a divorce, then parents were more likely to have depressive symptoms. If adult children were getting married or having kids, then parents were less likely to have depressive symptoms. Again, just a kind of obvious example of linked lives. And so let me ask you, kind of the reverse of the question I asked you earlier, is how have your life events or those of your siblings affected your parents or guardians, for better or for worse? Okay, so let's get into our theory paper example. These researchers specifically did an empirical study saying that they were using life course perspective to frame their research. So in the very first section of your paper, you just give an overview of the study. You really don't worry too much about the theory. And so you would indicate that this study was exploring how life stage interfaces with work. You talk about who they studied. You go into more detail than I have on the slide here, but this was a global study of about 41,000 IBM employees. And they divided the people in the study into 6 life stages. And you can see those listed here: before kids, during the transition to parenthood, which was in the first year after a baby being born, preschool-aged kids, school-aged kids, adolescent children, and empty nest. And I'm guessing that maybe they excluded people who didn't cleanly fit into one stage. And then what they were curious about is what were some of in thinking about the social context and the social institutions, what were some of the gender differences related to these life stages? And what they found is that basically men and women were more different in the middle stages than they were in the early stages or the late stages. So basically in those middle stages of kind of preschool age kids and school age kids, they found that men on average worked about 5 or 6 more hours per week than women did. Women had less upper level positions, and men reported experiencing higher work-family conflict than women. So in the second section of your paper, you get to basically ignore the article and just explain the theory to us. Tell us about family development or life course perspective. And specifically, we want to hear you, in your own words, describe a minimum of 6 concepts or assumptions drawn from lecture and the textbook. In the third section of your paper, you basically go through your article looking for clues of how they used life course perspective or family development theory. In this case, it was life course perspective, and you can highlight it either with a highlighter or electronically, and then just summarize it here. You can be saying they explicitly named life course perspective in their theoretical model and in their theoretical framework, in their literature review, and they talked about and described family stages. They talked about the timing of people's family stages. They talked about transitions between stages. You could be saying what they said. And then they also highlighted 2 key social contexts around gender and work. Okay, so in this 4th section, the critical evaluation section, I basically put my thinking cap on and I evaluate how well they used life course perspective. So I kind of go back to, in section 2, this is how I described life course perspective. In section 3, this is how I said they used it. What they do well, what could they do differently? And so maybe I say, yeah, they were very clear about using life course perspective to guide their research on these 6 life stages. And they, in addition to addressing the concepts of stage, they also talked about social context and trajectory. But one thing that they could have done is they could have made this a longitudinal study and studied cohorts, this other concept in life course perspective, over time. They could have gotten a new sample every 5 or 10 years and then followed them to see how did these experiences, especially in those more intensive child raising years, change over time with gendered roles. And they could have been maybe more explicit in using the concept of meaning making and how people are making meaning around work and family roles, and historical time and how that's maybe changing gendered work and family roles over time. So in the 5th and final section of your paper, we ask you to pick one of the other 5 theories that we're studying in this first unit on family theories. And so in this case, I've picked family systems, and first I'd kind of briefly describe it. And then I would say, how would I do things differently if I was coming at this study from a family systems perspective rather than a life course perspective? So I might gather data from people about their partners or their childcare providers, and I would hypothesize that their job responsibility and hours worked could be actually predicted by the roles and interactions they have with partners or other family members or childcare providers and kids. And so I might be drawing on family systems assumptions and concepts such as roles and interdependence and wholeness. In terms of thinking about the results of this study, I might say, well, mothers who are working less hours probably have a partner who's working more, and fathers who are working more hours are likely to have a partner working less, or other family members taking on the bulk of that childcare. All right, great job making it to the end of another lecture video. Have a good rest of your day.